So imagine every day for 10 years, what would that be? 3,650 times, seeing about 20 images of allegedly people standing on the moon and thinking it's the most glorious thing of all time. And then when I'm 14 years old, I see an interview. He was one of the first guests on Oprah, and his name was William Casey. He had very high security clearance at NASA because he would edit the memos between von Braun, the rocket designer, and the Pentagon to correct their grammar and make them look a little more educated than they really were. And he had to have high security clearance, and he read all these classified memos, including one from von Braun to the Pentagon, warning them that the odds of going to the moon on the first attempt with 1/millionth the computing power of a modern cell phone was probably a 1 in 10,000 chance, which is virtually guaranteeing killing the crew on live international television.
Wow.
And in order to guarantee the successful mission during the Vietnam War protests, they faked it. And so it caught me as an open-minded 14-year-old, thank goodness. I'm like, oh, never thought about that. So then I look at the pictures with new eyes. And sure enough, in the original pictures, if you can find a book from the library and borrow it, or find collector's editions on eBay, the original picture showed the lunar soil as a caramel brown, which is what it actually is if you're there. They know this from unmanned probes, and you'll see the Chinese probes today, which I believe are genuine, have a caramel brown surface. And then in the photographs, the fake projected backdrops were grayish blue. And you could pretty easily see a straight line going across horizontally. And I'm like, oh yeah, there's the fake backdrop right there. And as a filmmaker, which I would later become, they're standing incredibly close to the fake backdrops, closer than I would put them if I were directing it. And so later, NASA put a blue filter on it and made the soil and the background the same color, so it doesn't show up as much. And that's what you see online today. So that kind of planted a seed in my mind, Shaun. It's like, I wonder about that. Well, as it would have it, 10 years go by, I'd become a filmmaker. Remember, a filmmaker's job is to make fake scenes look real, right? So that's how I could tell that these things were shot in electrical lighting. In fact, you could prove the moon landing fraud with a single picture of a shadow of an astronaut going at 12 o'clock and a rock 5 feet away. The shadow's at 9 o'clock. A 90-degree difference from 5 feet apart. Just go out in a parking lot or your front yard on noon on a cloudless day with you and a friend 5 feet apart, and you'll see sunlight is always parallel no matter which way you go. So if they're intersecting at 90 degrees, that's electrical light, which means they're on the moon, because it can't be duplicated scientifically in sunlight. So you can prove it's fake by one picture. So I was editing one day for the client who produced the TV show I had seen as a 14-year-old 10 years earlier. He put me in touch with William Casey, who said, hey, you're a filmmaker. You should do a film about the fake moon landing. I thought, well, let me think about this. So I literally took off for 6 months, paid myself a salary, started investigating it. Found out that 2 of the 3 astronauts on the famous mission refused to ever give an interview about it. That's kind of strange. Found out the administrator of NASA resigned days before the first mission. Kind of strange when you want to be part of this great thing. And the Soviets had launched everything first, the first animal, satellite, orbit, spacewalk, crew of 3, and they never went to the moon. And then you had, of course, Tricky Dick Nixon at the helm, and of course, the photographic anomalies, being able to see a fake background, shadows intersecting. And I'm like, maybe they really did fake it. And I kind of, Shaun, I have this, you could say, relentless personality. I don't like to lose. I don't like giving up on a goal. If there's a will, there's a way. That's my motto. And knowing that about myself and knowing that I like puzzles, I used to draw mazes as a child. I said, if anyone could figure this out, it would be me. And then I realized if they did not go, and I start overturning these rocks, that could be hazardous to my health. So I actually turned down the project. I said, I want to have a wife and family someday. No, thank you. About 5 years go by, another client challenges me to read the Bible. Now, I wasn't a Christian, but I'm like, oh, well, I guess so. And it didn't exactly turn me into a Christian. I was still, being a pretty worldly playboy. However, it did convince me that there is right and wrong, and good versus evil, and basically truth versus lies. And I realized that if they faked it, that's more profound historically than if they had actually gone. Do you see that? If they faked the greatest accomplishment of mankind and murdered people to keep it a secret and embezzled $200 billion and held ticker tape parades for these guys, gave them medals of honor for lying, that's more significant than if they had actually gone. And I said, look, I'm going to die anyway. This is a just cause. It's worth risking my life for. So I changed my mind. A few days later, as serendipity would have it, I meet a multimillionaire who designs rockets for NASA, who knows that it's fake. He said, Bart, I'm going to give you $1 million to produce these films to prove the moon landing is fake. So 3.5 years into the 7-year project that suggests maybe the moon landings were faked, we find classified footage of fake photography of them faking being halfway to the moon right in front of your eyes. Multiple takes of a 1-foot model with a third track of the audio of the CIA telling them how to create a fake radio delay to make it appear they're further away from the Earth. And here we are 50 years later, and the Artemis project can only send mannequins to orbit the moon, but somehow 50 years ago, with 1 million computing power of a cell phone, they were playing golf on the moon. You know, so that's another way you could prove it. First, the photograph proves it. It cannot be duplicated in sunlight, which means it's electrical light, which means they're on Earth. Secondly, it's never happened in the history of the world that technology was greater in the past than in the future, because today NASA can only send astronauts 250 miles into space. So they went 1,000 times farther 50 years ago. Well, that means it was greater technology in the past and in the future, but that's a scientific and historical impossibility. So that proves it. Then we have the classified footage that I talked about. That's 3 proofs. And then, as I'm about to edit my book, which took 15 years to write, 2 years to edit, it's at Sibrel, my last name, SIBREL.com. You can get it in audio. I read it, Kindle or print. I'm put in touch with a gentleman, and this is new information I'm about to say. I did not publish what I'm about to say in my book because the man's relative was still alive, dying of cancer, and he didn't want to deal with the publicity. The gentleman's name was Cyrus Eugene Akers. He was chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968. He stood beside President Johnson while they filmed the fake moon landing June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1968. President Johnson gave him a list of 15 people who were allowed in the visitor's door to observe. He gave that list to me. And I'm about to tell you something I've also not put in the book. The real deathbed confession. Cyrus Eugene Akers was dying, and he had done some things that he regretted. He believed in God, and it is suggested in the Bible, if you simply confess your sin and make a commitment not to do it again, God will forgive you. And he wanted to not go to hell, right? And so he said, really, what's the more important confession? He murdered a coworker who was going to become a whistleblower and tell what he had witnessed and go to a reporter. I don't know whether he was ordered to kill him or did it as his own initiative as the chief MP on the base, but he did it. He murdered somebody to keep it a secret. That was really what he wanted to get off his chest. He said, the reason why I killed them was the fake moon landing. And then he kind of defended it. They must have had a really good reason why they were doing it. Well, I don't know about that one. So all this is in my new book, Moon Man, the true story of a filmmaker on the CIA hit list. And the reason why it's called that is because after we produced, a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, which you can see for free at Sibrel.com. In fact, the book is interactive with 16 video links. I write a chapter and I say, look, I'm about to talk about the film. Watch link 1, watch the film first. Then, and then I show another clip of NASA admitting they can't leave Earth orbit and so forth. And basically, after the first film, I guess from maybe childhood courtroom dramas I'd seen on TV, I thought, why don't we just track down these guys? We got a millionaire, hire a bunch of private detectives to track down these guys, put a Bible in front of them and see if they'll take an oath that they walked on the moon. It was during that occasion that I got punched by Buzz Aldrin. Another astronaut threatened to shoot me One threatened to hit me. One literally kicked me from behind because I showed him the classified footage on the tape of them faking being halfway to the moon. The guy turns beet red, starts cursing, get out of my house, literally kicks me from behind. So in the commotion, Shaun, I left the wireless microphone on the guy, and in the commotion, my camera guy's freaking out. He forgets to hit stop recording. So while the astronaut and his son are in their house with the doors closed and the cameras in the back seat of the rental car in the driveway in front of the house, we're recording the private conversations of the astronaut and his son in his house. And 3 months after the fact, when the secretary of the film is doing the transcript, she calls me up, panicked. Bart, do you know what they're talking about in their house? When you left the mic on and the camera recording? Like, I don't know what. They're talking about calling the CIA to have you assassinated. And I'm like, oh, that's funny. She says, no, Bart. They're talking about calling the CIA to have you assassinated. I'm like, yeah, that's funny. She says, Bart. They're talking about calling the CIA to have you assassinated. Now, if they really went to the moon, and I'm some silly person who thinks it was done in a TV studio, why would the CIA care? Unless, like I showed him, I had proof that they didn't go. Well, a couple of good guys in the government told me to call 2 people on that list while I was editing my book. And shortly thereafter, my source's house was broken into. And all the records of this guy being in the Air Force that they could find were confiscated. And 2 days after that, this is less than 2 years ago, 2 government employees show up and face-to-face threaten to kill him and his family if he ever spoke to me again. Now, why would that be necessary if they really went to the moon, right?
Wow.
Thank you for letting me do my essay. You're very patient, Shaun.
Yeah, on this channel, we don't cut long stories short. I just like to sit here and listen and not say anything. We've got a few people, and I was asked to ask you this before the interview, are asking about Stanley Kubrick's role in in faking the video. There's various theories. Do you subscribe to any of that?
Well, you're in the UK, and that's where he lived and where he was from. And so, yeah, I mean, you just kind of have to think, what would I do if I were them? Okay, they're faking the moon landing, so they have to have fake pictures. If they can't convince people through the photography or TV images that it's fake, they're sunk. So they have 2 choices. They could hire the general of the media department of the Pentagon and get good security and amateur results. Or they could hire the best filmmaker on the planet, get the short-term benefit of good-looking pictures, and worry about security later. That had to be the choice that they made. And Stanley Kubrick in 1968, when it was being filmed at Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico, happened to be shooting a film about going to the moon, 2001: A Space Odyssey. And there are pictures of him, Stanley Kubrick at NASA, strolling around with, the flight director and the CEO of NASA. Why would he be there? And then in his film, The Shining, and there's a couple of documentaries about this, there is apparently multiple clues about the moon landing fraud. Now, some of them are a bit overly poetic, but if a third of them are true, then it's true. And one in particular, the little, red rum boy, he stands up and he's got a hand knit shirt that says Apollo 11 right on it. And I think, he did it. That's who I would have picked. I think 2001 is probably still the best science fiction film ever made. And that was done with 1968 technology, and it's still the most realistic. The guy was a genius. And then people don't remember Apollo 12, 6 months later, they accidentally pointed the TV camera into the sun, so there were no pictures. Then Apollo 13 on April 13th at 1313 military time had an accident, which was only contrived because after they went to the moon the second time, people were complaining reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted. So they'd added that for drama. What that means is they had 2 years between the time that Kubrick shot the first one to get their act together and to figure out how to do it for Apollo 14. And I think some of the later missions, 14 through 17, were likely filmed in England. There's a big dirigible hangar not too far from London where it's believed, and there's photographic evidence to support it, that that's where some of the later missions were, because they decided to have larger landscapes and they needed a larger space than Cannon Air Force Base could provide. My dad being in the Air Force, I'd never heard of Cannon Air Force Base. I looked it up. It's tiny, which is great because there's fewer eyewitnesses. And then every branch of the military has their CIA type department, special ops. Well, out of the whole world, guess where the headquarters of the special ops for the United States Air Force is? Cannon Air Force Base. And then I had to pull out my own interview of William Casey from the archives. I'm like, didn't he say something about the Air Force? And I have him saying the whole thing, the whole faking of the moon landing was supervised by General Sam Phillips of the United States Air Force. And then one of the people on this list, I had heard of most of them, like Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, von Braun, Van Allen. There was one guy on there I hadn't heard of, or some of them, Robert Emenaker, which was like a science fiction consultant. And I got an email from someone saying in one of his autobiographies, he said he was at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 for a classified reason. So then you get to, well, what does this mean? We have a government that claims to be a light on a hill to the world. And every time someone is democratically elected, they send in the CIA to kill them. They boast about it in the New York Times, which is completely illegal, and no one does anything about it. You have William Benny, who worked for the NSA for 30 years, says, oh, by the way, we spy on the private cell phone conversations of Supreme Court justices so we can get sexual and financial dirt on them to blackmail them to vote the way we tell them. No one contradicts that that's a fact. Not a single investigation. How can that be? The corrupt government, it just would blow your mind. And the moon landing fraud is just the crowning achievement of their complete arrogance and disregard for the people they care. And then there were new revelations in the book that I did not put in the film because some of the people were still alive and asked that I do it after they died. The second to the last chapter in Moon Man, which is at Sibrel.com, is called NASA's Greatest Fear. The crew that was going to be the crew to walk on the moon first died in an accident, January 27th, 1967. According to the dead man's widow, who I interviewed for 4 hours, and according to the dead man's son, who I interviewed for 3 hours. He was murdered by the CIA. He came home the day before, said, Han, for the first time ever, the CIA is all over the launch pad. I wonder why. Next day, the guy's dead. They go to his house. They take his papers that he's, sending to Congress and the Senate about how they're 10 years away from going to the moon. They confiscate him before they even tell his widow that he's dead. That's their accusation, not mine. I'm just passing it on. And I figure they know. I mean, if Bobby Kennedy Jr. says his uncle was killed by the CIA, I would think he's the expert on the fact, right? And if the dead man's wife and son, who's a 747 pilot, says his father and husband, who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon, was murdered because he wouldn't cooperate, I believe him. And so it'd be one thing, Shaun, if they faked the moon landing and killed nobody. Then it's in a way, respect their cleverness. Hey, they did a good counterfeit. They sold the fake Picasso to some sucker. Hey, good job. But it's worse than that. Not only did they take our hard-earned money, a third of our labor or more, to deceive us, they used our money, our labor, to murder our fellow citizens who were trying to expose their crimes, because we paid the salary of those CIA agents who killed their own people. We paid for the hardware that they used to contrive that accident. You see that? And these people are still running the show, because until the moon landing fraud comes out, those people and their offspring are still running the show. So that's why Orwell said, whoever controls the past, the moon landings are real when they're not. Those same criminals run the future. And what we have here is a cartel of gangsters running the United States of America. It makes no difference whether it's red and blue. Don't be suckered into that, fighting each other so we don't go after them. Just ask Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders, right? It didn't. They won't let either of them go to the top, right? So something's going on, and it doesn't really matter who you vote for, because Congress and the Senate, did they vote on whether to fake the moon landing? No, they weren't even asked. So your elected officials, your voting does no good whatsoever. We had 90% of Americans who wanted GMO labeling on a bottle of ketchup. Please tell me if I'm about to swallow a GMO.
Hope you're enjoying this podcast. There's a word from our sponsor, Rocket Money. The other day, I had to cancel 3 Amazon Prime memberships. I had a personal on the UK Amazon, US Amazon, company account, US Amazon, UK Amazon. Do you understand how hard it is to cancel these bloody things? That's why Rocket Money makes these things so much easier, formerly known as Truebill. The app shows all your subscriptions in one place and cancels what you don't want for you. Rocket Money can even find subscriptions you didn't know you were paying for. Just like with me, with my 4 Amazon Prime memberships, you may find out you've been at least double charged for a subscription. To cancel a subscription, all you've got to do is press cancel and Rocket Money takes care of the rest. Get rid of useless subscriptions with Rocket Money now. Go to rocketmoney.com/Shaun, SHAUN. Seriously, it could save you hundreds per year. That's rocketmoney.com/Shaun, SHAUN. Thank you for supporting our sponsor, Rocket Money. Links in the description box. Cheers.
Have 90% of Americans agreed on anything since Pearl Harbor? No. And yet 90%, a democracy, the majority rules, which means 51% rules. So you have 90% wanting GMO labeling. The president says, no, I'm going to do what the corporations tell me to do.
All right. What is the motivation for faking the moon landing?
Well, you know, the first guy in the military told me it's all about money. It came out that Halliburton, was charging $40 for a 50-cent ice cube tray during the Iraq War. And that's what Eisenhower warned us about in his last day in office. He was afraid to say it during the 8 years of his presidency. How about that? Right? I'm warning you, this military-industrial complex, the profiteers off of war, they're running the show. He was afraid to say it. Kennedy said it. Look what happened to him. So money, I wouldn't think that money would be the number one reason. I thought it was pride because Kennedy said we'll go before the end of the decade and they couldn't do it. So they didn't want to eat humble pie. But people in the know who know more than me say it's money first. Now, NASA has never kept the schedule, not a single time. Just the Hubble telescope to go into Earth orbit, one little piece of equipment half the size of a car, 10 years behind schedule. In 2014, they said they're going to have people orbiting the moon in 2018, and they still haven't done that. What is that, 8 years later? They only have mannequins orbiting the moon, and that 8 years behind schedule. But for some reason, the most complicated space endeavor of all time was ahead of schedule. I mean, imagine that. So that pride had to be in there somewhere. And it was propaganda. Nixon, who was president at the time, said the number one threat to America is not Russia, it's not China, it's Americans who are protesting the federal government because of the Vietnam War. So why not give them something to cheer about? In the book, I mentioned the code name that apparently President Johnson personally came up with for the endeavor of faking the moon landing. He called the project Slam Dunk, meaning if you fake it, you can guarantee it'll be successful. Pretty true, right? And so when people were complaining, Americans are dying in the war, then they could give them this, bone. Look at this, something to cheer about, something to wave your flag at. And by the way, Robert McNamara said on his deathbed, he was defense secretary during the Vietnam War. Now, before December 7th, 1941, 90% of Americans were against entering World War II. 90%. Then Pearl Harbor happens and 90% are for it, right? And it was kind of that way when the war in Vietnam was going on, which was going on since the late 50s. 90% of Americans said, let's not get involved. You know what I mean? We remember World War II. We don't want to do this again. Okay? Let them solve their own problems. Well, so they're like, well, how can we get the U.S. We need a Pearl Harbor event. Well, it was called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where allegedly a North Vietnamese ship attacked an American ship. Well, Robert McNamara on his deathbed said, oh, by the way, we just made that up. The CIA just made that up.